In 1999, a company that mailed dog food through the post office at a loss to customers who could have bought it cheaper at the supermarket down the street was worth more than several actual airlines. This is not a joke. This actually happened. And understanding why it happened tells you almost everything about how humans behave when they think they're watching the future arrive. This is a story of the dot-com bubble, how a genuinely world-changing technology got bolted onto the most reckless speculative mania of the 20th century, how it inflated for 5 intoxicating years, how it popped in the span of about 18 months, and how out of the wreckage, the internet we actually use today quietly assembled itself. Chapter 1. The Spark. For nearly 3 decades before any of this began, the internet belonged to almost nobody. It lived in university basements and military research labs, a text-only world of command lines and acronyms, useful mainly to people with the patience to read a Unix manual for fun. Then, in 1993, a small team at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications released a browser called Mosaic. For the first time, images and text sat together on the same page, and a computer science degree was no longer required to find your way around. That same year, Congress opened the internet to commercial use, and a handful of very alert people in finance and technology quietly realized this was going to be bigger than email. The fuse was lit on August 9th, 1995, when a small browser company called Netscape went public. Bankers had planned to price the shares at $14. Demand was so overwhelming that the price was raised 3 times in the days before the offering, first to $21, then to $24, and finally to $28. And even that wasn't enough. Netscape opened, tore higher, and closed its first day at just over $58. A company that had never turned a profit and barely had revenue was suddenly worth close to $3 billion. Wall Street had learned a new lesson that morning. A business no longer needed to make money to be worth a fortune. It just needed a story about the future and enough people willing to believe it. 6 months later, Congress deregulated the telecommunications industry, and companies like WorldCom, Global Crossing, and Lucent began racing to bury fiber optic cable across the country and along the ocean floor, on the assumption that internet traffic was about to consume every last strand of it. Some of these deals had a rotten trick hidden inside them. Telecom firms would lend money to their own customers, who then used that same money to buy equipment back from the lender. The same dollar got counted twice, once as a loan, once as a revenue. On paper, growth looked explosive. In reality, it was just money running in a circle. Chapter 2. The Mania. By the late 90s, the internet had stopped being a curiosity and become a religion. Venture capitalists who once studied balance sheets now reacted to the phrase online the way a dog reacts to a bag of chips opening. A founder needed only a domain name, a PowerPoint deck, and the phrase first mover advantage, repeated with enough conviction, and money would appear. Consider Pets.com, a company that shipped 50-pound bags of dog food through the mail, at a loss, competing against supermarkets that already sold the same bags cheaper and closer to home. It became famous not for its business model, which made almost no sense, but for its sock puppet mascot, who appeared on talk shows and floated over Manhattan in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Within 2 years, the puppet outlived the company that built it. Consider theglobe.com, an early social network years ahead of Facebook, which went public in 1998 and posted the largest first-day gain in the history of the stock market, up over 600% by the closing bell. Its young CEO was later filmed dancing on a nightclub table in vinyl pants, shouting to the cameras that he had the money and now intended to live, in his words, a frivolous life. Within 18 months, the stock had fallen from $97 to under a dime. Consider Boo.com, a British fashion retailer that convinced the world's biggest luxury houses and Wall Street banks to hand it $135 million for a website so graphically heavy it barely loaded over a dial-up connection. It burned through the entire sum in about 18 months and collapsed in the spring of 2000, becoming a byword alongside Cosmo, Flues, and Webvan for the sheer speed at which venture money could evaporate. Webvan promised to deliver groceries with the precision of a military operation, built out warehouses across the country, and ran through close to $1 billion trying to make grocery delivery cheaper than just walking to the store. Cosmo promised to deliver a single candy bar to your door in under an hour for free, in an era when the entire e-commerce industry made up a fraction of 1% of American retail. Priceline let travelers name their own price for airline seats, a genuinely clever idea, and went public in 1999 at a $10 billion valuation, even though it was quietly losing money on nearly every ticket it sold, buying inventory from airlines at prices well above what its customers were paying. None of this seemed to matter. In October of 1999, the roughly 200 internet stocks tracked by Wall Street's most influential analyst, Mary Meeker, carried a combined market value of $450 billion. Their combined annual sales came to about $21 billion. Their combined profits came to a negative number, over $6 billion in losses. One investment banker interviewed on television that year said with a straight face that founders were telling him the last thing they wanted was to be profitable because it would cost them their internet company valuation. Everyone wanted in. Chapter 3: The Peak and the Fall. On March 10, 2000, the NASDAQ Composite touched an all-time high of 5,048. It felt to almost everyone watching like a beginning rather than an ending. It was, in fact, the top. No single event caused the crash. It arrived instead as a slow accumulation of small, uncomfortable questions that investors had spent years refusing to ask. What is your revenue? How many paying customers do you actually have? Are you profitable? Or do you merely intend to be someday in a future nobody could quite describe? Around the same time, a wave of lockup expirations meets the 6-month window that prevents company insiders from selling shares right after an IPO hit dozens of companies simultaneously. The people who understood these businesses best began quietly cashing out, and the flood of new shares hitting the market overwhelmed what demand remained. The Federal Reserve, worried about an overheating economy, kept raising interest rates, squeezing the speculative bubble even further. Then came the reckoning. A Lehman Brothers analyst published a report tearing into Amazon's finances in February 2000. Jeff Bezos publicly dismissed it as nonsense, but the stock fell anyway, and kept falling, losing 95% of its value before it was through. Webvan admitted to catastrophic losses. Pets.com admitted it was hemorrhaging cash with no plan to stop. Confidence turned into confusion, and confusion into a rush for the exits. Over the following 2 years, the NASDAQ fell 78%, from 5,048 down to 1,114. More than half of all dot-com companies simply ceased to exist. Roughly $5 trillion in market value vanished. By some measures, nearly $1 trillion of it in stock value alone within the first month after the peak. Office ping-pong tables and foosball tables ended up in dumpsters. Engineers who had been recruited with stock options worth a fortune on paper walked away with nothing. Venture capital, which had been pouring in like floodwater, dried up almost overnight. By September of 2001, for the first time in 26 years, an entire month passed on Wall Street without a single new IPO. The party, by any measure, was over. Chapter 4: Who survived and why? Not everyone burned, and the companies that made it through the fire shared a set of qualities that in retrospect seem almost boringly obvious and were almost completely absent from the companies that didn't. Amazon's stock fell from around $100 to roughly $6 a share, and the press had all but written its obituary, running headlines like Amazon.bomb. Jeff Bezos didn't chase a bigger vision. He shrank the company's ambitions on purpose, shut down unprofitable side projects, cut costs ruthlessly, and refocused entirely on one unglamorous idea: get products to customers faster and cheaper than anyone else could. It wasn't inspiring. It was logistics. It worked. Google, at the time, wasn't even a public company. Just 2 Stanford graduate students refining a search algorithm in a converted garage, funding themselves with a quiet advertising experiment called AdWords that nobody outside the company thought much about yet. eBay kept doing one unglamorous thing extremely well, connecting a buyer who wanted something with a seller who had it, whether that was a rare coin or a box of Beanie Babies, and charging a small fee for the introduction. What separated the survivors from the casualties wasn't vision, and it certainly wasn't marketing budget. It was profitability, or at least a believable, working path toward it. They had real customers paying for something they actually needed. They grew after they'd proven people wanted the product, not before. And there was a second, quieter kind of survivor, the infrastructure itself. All those billions poured into servers, fiber optic cable, and data centers didn't disappear when the companies that built them did. The cable stayed in the ground. The bandwidth sat there, mostly unused. As much as 85% of American broadband capacity was still idle 5 years after the crash, waiting for someone to find a use for it. Like a network of roads built by an empire that later collapsed, the skeleton of the boom outlived the boom itself. Chapter 5. The Reboot. By 2003, the fog had cleared enough for a new generation of builders to get to work, quietly this time, with none of the launch parties or Super Bowl ads. Facebook started in a Harvard dorm room. YouTube came together in a garage above a pizzeria. None of them needed the theatrics of 1999, because the infrastructure their predecessors had already paid for, the cheap bandwidth, the cheap servers, the entire buried skeleton of the old boom, was sitting right there, waiting to be used. Then in January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and held up a small glass rectangle. The iPhone didn't just give people a new device, it changed the relationship people had with the internet itself. From something you dialed into and waited for, to something you simply carried in your pocket, always on, always with you. The dot-com bubble had promised that the internet would change everything. It just took the crash and everything that got quietly built in its aftermath to actually deliver on that promise. Conclusion. 25 years later, the sock puppet is a punchline and the crash is a case study taught in business schools as a monument to collective delusion. But it's worth remembering that the delusion and the achievement were never really separate things. The same 5 years that minted 1,000 worthless companies also buried the fiber optic cable that would carry Netflix and YouTube. The same investors who threw money at a website for mailing socks to dogs also, almost by accident, funded the plumbing of the modern internet. The internet didn't die in 2000, it just went quiet for a while, long enough to figure out what it was actually for.